Good morning. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, the T-20 Chair and Director General of MPIDSA, which is Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. I hope I am correct, Ambassador? And this is, okay. And this is the foremost think tank on strategic affairs in India, as my friends here know, but for the benefit of people coming from outside. My friend Kevin Gallagher, Director of Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and our partner for this event, who is joining online from Paris. Actually, very unfortunate thing happened. Kevin started from Boston to join us here physically, but on the way he stopped by Paris and he was tested positive for COVID, please. And he is in quarantine and joining from there. So we, of course, miss him physically here, and we wish him very speedy recovery. He will be joining online for the next session also and making his presentation. He insists that he will make a presentation online. So that is his commitment. And my colleague Kamal Malhotra and all of the very distinguished friends and participants of this policy roundtable, T-20 policy roundtable on finance and global economic governance for sustainable or clean transition. So this is something which we have been doing for planning for some time under the T-20, which is an engagement group of G20. And as we know, G20 has emerged as a very influential forum for discussion on global affairs, although it started as a mechanism or forum for addressing the crisis, global financial crisis to be very precise. But over time, its agenda has expanded to cover development issues and common development challenges that the world faces, including sustainable development and climate change agenda. And T-20, chaired by Ambassador Chinoy, is a thinking arm of G20, if I may say so. And under the leadership of Ambassador Chinoy, T-20 in India has broken the ground with an inception conference which was held in January this year in Taj Palace Hotel, very big group, and subsequently number of activities have taken place. I have been part of some of them, so I know. And hundreds of policy briefs on very important themes are being prepared under this forum of T-20. And ISID and Boston University Global Development Center, Global Development Policy Center, are very proud to be part of T-20 process and to contribute to its activities through this event. So this event basically, is taking place, as you know, against the backdrop of very important foreign ministers meeting, which started yesterday, continues till today, and the Raisina dialogue, which begins this evening with Prime Minister's address, and then the number of other meetings, including T-20 town hall, global town hall, which happens on 5th of March, and Ambassador Chinoy would lead that. So many discussions around the table, around the town, around all different cities, because T-20 and D-20 are spreading across the length and breadth of the country. which is a very good thing. We also went to a meeting in Bhopal in January, and Ambassador Chinoy was also part of that, I know. So this is a very important and exciting process to think about some of the issues of global concern and challenges that the world faces, and how we can find shared and common solutions to them. Now, this particular discussion today, we all know that implementation of climate action and sustainable development goals will require staggering amounts of resources in trillions of dollars. And the international community, we all know, has found it very challenging to meet the commitments on international resource transfers or financing, whether it was 0.7% of GNI target agreed in 1970s, or the US dollar $100 billion per year agreed at UNFCCC for meeting the climate change challenges. Both of them have remained unfulfilled till date. So in that context, there is a search of new sources of finance, new sources of revenue, because budgets are stretched everywhere. And in that context, I think we need to discuss and debate what could be the ways forward to find the resources to allow and enable developing countries in particular to meet the challenges of net zero by 2050 and the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, which will provide a life of dignity to all the people. So I think this is a very timely and topical theme for this discussion today here, and I'm very happy that all of you are there to contribute to this discussion. And this is a discussion which is very central and very close to the heart of ISID and also BU, the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, which Kevin heads. Because we are concerned about, at this institute, about helping the country with industrial transformation. And in today's world, industrial transformation has to be sustainable industrial transformation or green industrial transformation. And so we're finding resources and global financial and economic architecture which is fit for purpose and supports this kind of transformation. Clean energy transition, clean industrial transformation are very central themes. So I'm very happy that all of you are here, and I don't want to take much of your time. So with these words, I want to welcome you once again, and I'm sure we will have very productive discussions. Now I want to invite Ambassador Chinoy to deliver his inaugural remarks, which I'm sure will set the tone of our discussions for the rest of the day. Ambassador Chinoy is very well known to my Indian friends, but for the benefit of colleagues coming from outside, Ambassador Chinoy is a very distinguished member of Indian Diplomatic Corps or Indian Foreign Service. He has served as ambassador in many important countries like Mexico and Japan, both G20 members. He has also served in many important positions in Indian missions in different countries and in United Nations, also in the National Security Advisory Board. And he is seen in the country and recognized as a foremost expert on strategic issues. And he has now the very important task of steering the T-20 process and getting some real ideas for the leaders to consider. So with those words, welcome Ambassador Chinoy, and the floor is yours. Yeah.
Good morning to all of you. Let me begin by firstly thanking Professor Nagesh Kumar for this invitation to come and be with you all this morning at this very important event organized by the ISID and the Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dean Tetsushi Sonobe-san, who is the T-7 chair, and therefore my good friend and counterpart as well. And I want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Kamal Malhotra. And online, I wish to acknowledge the presence of Professor Kevin Gallagher. And you might wonder, first off, as to what exactly is the DG of what has just been introduced as India's defense think tank doing here in a room full of experts on finance and global economic governance, a room full of economists. The only sort of explanation that I have in my defense is to say that economic and financial matters are much too important to be left to economists alone. As they say, war is much too important a matter to be left to generals alone. And so therefore, I find myself in this room. But more relevantly, it's also because it's a misnomer to say that the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis focuses only on defense issues. It does not. It does a lot more. It focuses on various issues at the confluence of defense, security, and international relations. And when I speak of security, it obviously covers non-traditional security issues. And in this day and age, when we are perforce looking at the securitization of finance, the securitization of globalization, the securitization of investments, of technology, it is virtually impossible to segregate these two spaces, just as it is virtually impossible to segregate the space involving domestic developments in any country today and external developments as well. So it is entirely apposite and opportune that I stand before you to deliver a few remarks, perhaps also to force you to think a little differently. Now let me begin by simply saying the obvious, that the G20 is an extremely important group, and to my mind, it is perhaps the only group outside of the United Nations Security Council which actually has the potential to put people together in a room to discuss issues that concern the global community today. For a moment, I might have been tempted to even think of the East Asia Summit process, and I did a head count there, and there are 18 members there. But the trouble with the East Asia Summit process is that the very nomenclature itself suggests that it is restricted to one geography. It is certainly not something that is globally representative like the G20, in which you have 19 countries, major economies, plus the EU available in a particular group. While it is essentially recommendatory in nature, it is also perhaps capable of providing ideas and solutions to some of the world's greatest challenges, simply if we go by the record of the G20, for it has been able to reinvent itself each time there has been a challenge and upgrade its discourse, the quality and content of its discourse, as we've seen after the Asian financial crisis in 1997, when the finance and central government banks governors' tracks got formalized, so to speak. We've also seen how it reinvented itself in 2008, once again after the global financial and economic crises, which lasted, in its own sort of way for a couple of years, suggesting that that too was a period of polycrises. And we have seen how since 2008 there have been certain reforms as well. One of the earliest reforms that I recall is the fact that in 2008 there was a decision taken, for instance, to provide special extra voting rights in the IMF. And these went up from 250 to 750. And so a step like that did help the global community to look at things differently. We have seen how a couple of years later, again, in the context of the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions, the IMF did take a hard look at the 14th Review Conference at the so-called quota system, which drives the SDRs. And more on that later. But let me contextualize this G20. This G20 for me is an opportunity to really get people off the gridlocked highway of international relations, away from the United Nations, away from the UN Security Council, away from those saloons of international discourse where people have already taken very hard and coagulated positions, and to allow them an opportunity to step aside in a country like India that brings its own very credible stamp to this particular event, and perhaps make an effort to go in for low-hanging fruit without losing face. So I think for me, the G20 is very important in that context, and it is entirely appropriate that it coincides with a very fortuitous period in India's growth trajectory. India, having come out of the pandemic as a very resilient economy, are having, relatively speaking, done well to control the COVID pandemic, are having done very well with regard to this whole idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is a family, and providing in that particular civilizational ethos and context 100 countries with 250 million vaccines. So this is a country that is set to grow to become possibly the third, if not the second largest economy in the world over the next 20 years or so. It is a country that has notched up 7% growth rates, which are expected to be seen for the next decade and a half. Therefore, it is entirely appropriate that we should be holding the G20 at this point of time. It augurs very well that as India leads the G20, we have a very friendly and strategic partner, Japan, leading the G7. And the G20 really is, in a way, representative. In a microcosm, it represents the entire world, for it has the G7 in it. It also has the BRICS in it. It has a large number of other economies driven by commodities. And there is a fair sprinkling from the geography around the world. So apart from this, I would say that it's for the first time that 4 developed nations are chairing it back to back with Indonesia, India, to be followed by Brazil and South Africa. So it's an opportune moment to really emphasize the interests of the global South, particularly using the kind of approach suggested by the Prime Minister of India in his interaction with 123 countries of the global South, when the Prime Minister of India said that we want it to be a presidency that reflects and responds to the requirements of the global South. So that word responding in accordance with the needs of the global South was very much front and center in the Prime Minister's speech. To recognize, the principle of, CDR, that these are differentiated yet, some kind of common, contributions. And we must also respect sovereignty of individual countries, as also reform, the financial structures that have remained in stasis for the past 77 years. For we all know that the UN and its affiliated structures, many of which are treaty organizations like the Bretton Woods structures, reflect the priorities, perhaps also in stark fashion, the balance of power as it emerged at the end of that Great War. And there's certainly not in tune with the realities of the 21st century. And that really puts a great deal of pressure on why all this needs a fair bit of rethink. Let me get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty as I broadly understand it. For me, by the way, this is like education. Being with economists, I'm learning every day. When I listen to you, I'm growing as an individual. But at a very simple level, what struck me is that the world has been doing its best, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, when macroeconomic fiscal stability is a great priority and growth and recovery is an immense priority. And yet there are 75 or more countries exhibiting different levels of debt distress. And so we have seen how in 2020, the debt service and suspension initiative to the tune of roughly $12.9 billion was actually agreed to. And yet at the same time, I'm kind of alarmed when I read further the fine text that in an organization like the IMF, there is still a surcharge that amounts to $4 billion. And so on the one hand, there is generosity in terms of the DSSI. On the other hand, not much, I'm told, has been done with regard to the surcharge of $4 billion, which certainly seems a bit usurious at these times. There is also the issue of SDRs in the IMF in particular, and we did see a one-time measure of special SDRs, extra SDRs, whatever the jargon is, to the tune of 650 billion US dollars. But it was only a one-time measure, which takes a person like me, who is not an economist, to further question this very quota system. I was intrigued to see that the quota system is, as you all know much better than I do, really reflecting the relative weight of a certain economy in the global, economy. And we have seen how the United States, of course, being the largest economy, remains the largest economy and is showing new signs of renaissance and growth, and R&D has something like 17.5%. And China's share was increased to some extent a decade or so ago, when it overtook the Japanese economy, I think around 2010 or so. You would know better. But as I look at India's share, despite the fact that today India's GDP contributes something like 3.4% to the global GDP, its share is only 2.75%. And when you look at a relatively spent economy like the United Kingdom, and pardon me for using that blunt term, and I hope there are no Brits or pommies in the room. I run the risk of riling them. But the point is that, just giving an example, that the UK, for instance, has a share which is about 4.4% or so, whereas its contribution as a GDP to the global GDP is around 3.26%. And so when might these things change is the question for me. The earlier this is done, the better it is. Another key question for me is bridging between the old institutions and the new institutions. As a parallel to the Bretton Woods institutions, we have seen how, in fact, the world has come up with new attempts and new structures, and I can think of one obvious one, the AIIB, for instance, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And in this, I find that there is a fair bit of dichotomy. In a sense, the AIIB has come up in order to meet the humongous requirements of capital for infrastructure in developing countries, perhaps running into trillions of dollars. One can see that it is also, in a way, a pushback against the Bretton Woods structures which are seen as occasionally intrusive, occasionally stentorian, demanding, prescriptive, and as an attempt by leading emerging economies, including China, to create parallel structures. But the dichotomy here is that when you look at the AIIB, it is actually supported by perhaps 5 out of the G7, except for the United States and Japan. And so there is, on the one hand, a dialogue between the members of the G7 and the AIIB. There is actually formal cooperation now between the AIIB and the ADB, the ADB being led and spearheaded by Japan, the AIIB featuring China as the largest economy, and yet there are points of disconnect. And so how we might look at these points of disconnect? Would it have been better to have actually had Japan and the United States supporting the AIIB in order to make it a little more egalitarian and less China-centric? That is the question that disturbs me. But I'm not sure if I have any answers to that. A few more points and then I will conclude. Look, multilateralism has been greatly weakened. But we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It may be imperfect, but we have to keep up the effort to rejuvenate multilateralism. And this, I think, can be attempted through the G20, especially because in the known corridors of power, the prescriptive corridors of power, positions are coagulated. It's virtually impossible for permanent members to defeat one another. And that is what might be better stated in this term, that permanent members of the Security Council are also hoist on their own petard. They have created a system in which there is veto power, and it's virtually impossible to erase that fact. And so it is outside of that structure that we will have to look for some answers and solutions. Multilateralism is weakened, it is fractured, but it is not yet fragmented. It is a simple fracture, it is not a compound fracture. And I think, therefore, there is hope, and we should be optimistic about the potential for giving it a healing touch during our presidency. All known vectors of globalization are under challenge today, and I would briefly put before you the 6 T's which are under great stress today. The T of trade, the T of technology, the T of territorial disputes and differences, the T of terrorism, without addressing which we cannot have stability and prosperity in any society, the T of tenets, as in narratives as to whose systems of governance, social, political, economic, are superior. We have been subjected to that. We have been relentlessly exposed to that discourse today. That binary choice that is placed before every developing country today is vastly different from the Cold War of an earlier period when there were no binary choices. There was an option to either join one camp or the other. But today, in this globalized world in which everyone is interlinked to everyone else, the choices for the developing world become that much more difficult and starker, especially if presented with a binary choice. And so when there is a binary choice presented by contending major powers, it should fall upon the shoulders of large, emerging, resilient economies like India to do something about giving extra choices, to provide a spectrum beyond the binary choice. And I think we are capable of doing that. We in the T20 are determined to make a success of India's G20 presidency. We have 11 engagement groups. Mine is only one of them, but you can call it the Ideas Bank. It is the one that is expected to put everything together. And we have got off to a very, very splendid start, not without the support of many of you who are present in this room today. And in these 11 engagement groups, we are also collaborating with all the other engagement groups. We, as Professor Nagesh mentioned, had the Inception Conference. We are going to have a town hall on the 5th of March. In May, we will have a midterm kind of global event. And finally, we have our, event, the summit, you might call it, will be in August, the 1st and 2nd of August in the beautiful city of Mysore. And we have 7 different task forces. Some of you are actually involved in each of these task forces, and I don't want to go into those details. But let me end by saying that essentially we have to look for a new kind of globalization today. We have to remember that globalization is like a genie that cannot be put back in the bottle, must not be put back in the bottle. It has to be, reformed. Those that have gamed the system must be prevented from doing so. Those that have not entirely benefited must be given a fair chance to do so. And as we proceed, we will also have to look at the areas of technology transfers, investments, where, unlike in the case of trade, the denial regimes, export controls, sanctions have much more play. Trade is fungible. It's very hard to control. It is basically spearheaded by the private sector, by entrepreneurs and industries and the market forces of demand and supply. But when it comes to technology, one of the 6 T's that I mentioned, there it is possible for the world to once again split into those that have technologies and those that don't have technologies. When it comes to your subject, especially where you're looking for finance and global economic governance for green transitions, I think you have a major problem, because some of the figures that I come across are that, and correct me if you please, Professor, that you require something like $3.5 trillion to $4 trillion annually for a just and equitable green transition. You also require trillions of dollars, to ensure that there is economic recovery. On the other hand, the war in Ukraine is sucking the oxygen out of the key, SDGs that we are looking at. Look at the quantum of money that is required today, as of today, to rebuild Ukraine. I read a figure of 750 billion euros and counting. As every day passes, as the war progresses, this figure is only going to grow. You look at the amount of money that is made available for the SDGs, it's a pittance in comparison. So we need to get our priorities right at this stage, the global community. And one country that is capable of providing this fresh look at the SDGs is India. For the world not only needs access to vaccines for the pandemic, it also needs a new kind of vaccine, a vaccine that will inject the global community with new ethics and a new morality, a sense of broader well-being, where you do not beggar your neighbors, you do not look at your interests versus somebody else's interests. And I think it is India that has proved itself capable of providing that fresh thinking, one in which we will bring concepts like ethics, morality, well-being into concepts like lifestyle for environment or green transitions, etc. What is the alternative there, pray? Because you always do subscribe to this broad point that the problem of climate change cannot be taken on head-on without the global community working as a whole. It's like pollution. If there is pollution in China or in India, it is likely to spread to any other country as well. So the issue of climate action, which is uppermost in our minds, cannot be tackled without loosening of purse strings, without the developed world understanding that it's in their interest to enable such green transitions in finite periods of time, so as to enable the developed and the developing countries to achieve the net zero targets. Net zero targets deal with mitigation, but we also need to look at the larger issue of green transitions overall. as in what you might call in your jargon adaptation and stuff like that. And so that money will have to come from governments, it will have to come from the private sector, it will possibly have to come with a modicum of a profit principle, some benefit, but not usurious terms, certainly. And without that, there is nothing that you can do to prevent global warming from going beyond 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or even more. So the earlier we realize this, the better it is. And I am absolutely convinced that India's G20 presidency will be a great success. It will not be a great success without all of you joining hands to make it a great success. And I'm absolutely confident that that will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we expected nothing less from him, knowing that what stature and eminence he represents. So his address has actually set the tone for our discussions for the whole day and beyond. So it would keep us thinking and mulling about for many, many days to come. So now let me invite Mr. Kamal Malhotra, who is currently non-resident senior fellow of Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And because Kevin physically is not there, so we requested him to. But Kamal has been a member of United Nations for a long time. He served in many countries as the resident coordinator of United Nations. So Kamal, over to you.
Ambassador Chinoy, the Think 20 Chair and Director General, MP IDSA, Professor Nagesh Kumar, Director of ISID, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to join this inaugural session on behalf of Dr. Kevin Gallagher, Director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, who very much wanted to be here personally, but as Nagesh has already said, he got COVID while in Europe on his way here. Sadly, therefore, he is unable to join us, and while this is a big loss, he sends his greetings and regards. He has asked me to represent him and convey a few messages and give the vote of thanks on behalf of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center in this inaugural session. He should, as Nagesh has said, however, be able to join us later this morning and present online in session 1. The big message I wish to convey on his behalf, and I think the ambassador already referred to this, is that international institutions such as the United Nations that I served in for 2 decades or more, and the multilateral development banks are essential in this green transition despite the crises that they are facing. And this is because green transformation is a global public goods challenge. And even if one country does a lot, it will not benefit them much or anyone if others do not. And you need global international institutions to deal with global public goods issues. Also, there can and should be mechanisms for loss and damage through which the large historical emitters compensate small emitters. And the international institutions are best placed as neutral parties to play this role in many ways. The Global Development Policy Center at Boston University's expertise and priorities in the context of green transformation is on the multilateral development banks and development finance, with 3 overarching messages. First, increase the scale of financing for clean energy transitions through committed capital increases in the multilateral development banks and national level development finance institutions, the DFIs, and through implementation of the G20 recommendation on capital adequacy frameworks. Second, articulate a mission for development finance that is geared towards low carbon, climate resilient, and socially inclusive growth and development pathways. And third, create coordinating and pooling mechanisms whereby the multilateral development banks can combine balance sheets and cooperation efforts on clean energy transitions with national level development finance institutions from the G20 countries. This is just an inaugural set of comments. I will say a lot more in session 2, which I moderate. But ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank Professor Nagesh Kumar for agreeing to co-host and organize this important T20 side event with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and allow me to thank Ambassador Chinoy, the T20 chair, for accepting this as an official T20 event and for joining us at the opening today. I thank all of you, both physically present and online today, for joining us today, and I wish the event every success on behalf of Kevin and all of us associated with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and wish you a very good day.
I have to leave for another. But we brief briefly for key coffee outside and the liaison between 5 minutes.